all throughout the Central Asian sector. Enormous combat operations were already well underway, as the largest ever invasion force in the history of all humankind had been put together in terms of land, air, and sea bases, as the largest air armada, sea armada, and ground forces ever put together were not only breaking out of all of their CCP regime properties that had been strategically purchased by the Chinese Communist regime throughout America in many vital areas of strategic importance, some even dangerously adjacent to their given targets, also allowed for the external invasion forces to battering ram their way across the border as the Trojan shock forces broke out of their CCP properties and captured immediately their objectives. As this was only a 4-day-long total invasion, the Americans had never adapted and never learned lessons from the Great Eastern European proxy conflict that they should have learned, and instead had been defanged and demilitarized by the Russians, who outproduced them at every turn. As the Russians outproduced the entire collective West combined, they still had nothing on China's production. China was the most powerful nation in all of human history by real facts, figures, capabilities, stats, and more. They had the largest and most capable workforce in all existence, as they had the most science, technology, engineering, and math graduates. They also had an enormous population to draw on for their workforce, as well as also their armed forces, as they also already had the largest forces under arms as an aggregate of their paramilitary forces, which were all combat grade and armed and trained, and their active reserve and ready reserve military forces, which their ready reserves were all those that completed their contracts in the PLA and went into ready reserve group army status for 10 years. These were massive, enormous forces that were now breaking out of their CCP regime properties and going for their objectives, going for the jugular of America, as well as battering ramming their way across the border. It was imperative for the Trojan shock armies to capture all of the key nodes all up and down the major invasion routes, which also included I-10, as well as also on I-25, and most important of all, I-35, which bisected the nation and went straight into its heart. As coming up from Mexico and coming down from Canada, the forces would meet in the middle by the second day of the externals. According to fourth generation warfare doctrine, the externals should never have to get off the highway to engage enemy forces. They should be able to proceed straight through to their final destination, undeterred and unopposed. They should only ever have to stop for logistical resupply needs, maintenance needs, medical needs, or rearmament needs if they had to expend ammunition on the way up the interstate or the invasion route effectively. As this effectively was fourth gen doctrines, the Trojan shock armies taking center stage as they did all the heavy lifting. They captured all the objectives. They made it possible for all the key nodes to be under control, for the externals to move in deep. The externals were simply the reinforcements. As in previous ways of fighting war, they would have been the main mover and shaker of the operation, as the saying goes. But in fourth generation warfare, the Trojans, who already begin inside the target nation, are the main mover and shaker of the entire invasion. As the externals and Trojans would work seamlessly together, they would rapidly annihilate the American regime and its security forces, including its military and paramilitary elements, like its alphabet paramilitary and local paramilitary forces, even in the terms of the state forces. None of them were experienced, or neither did they train for such a situation. They had no planning to address such a situation, and they had no equipment to address such a situation, as again, Russia had opted to fight a war of attrition in which they outproduced the entire collective West combined, and not only did they demilitarize the proxy of the West and Eastern Europe, but they demilitarized the West and NATO along with it, as they continually sent ammunition that they couldn't afford to send, and vital platforms in many cases that they could scarcely afford to send as well. So there were certain key items that they drastically needed, like radar sets of specific types and other key equipment that they had effectively pissed away to be destroyed. Not only this, but also combat platforms had been sacrificed in massive numbers as well. And the Chinese, who hadn't even done anything, were effectively uppercutting America full force with their full might of all of their capabilities, their gargantuan size of numbers, and their quality of forces. The total invasion force of the Chinese being 10 million of their active reserve and ready reserve PLA forces, their PLAAF Air Force, PLAN Naval Forces, strategic missile forces, in addition to various branches of their paramilitary. They were simply gargantuan, as they also had a total of 29 million under arms when fully mobilized with their paramilitary and all of their military forces. China had the ability to do troop rotations and invade a nation as vast as America, as well as also having Russia on their side and even other Tier 2 powers, even Tier 3 powers, as the 500,000 strong Foreign Expeditionary Army, which was the icing on the cake, assisting them. This invasion force was far too massive for the American regime and its security forces to contend with. Even the armed reactionary civilians were not ready whatsoever at all, and those who fantasized about fighting off the Chinese at their mailbox were sorely disappointed when they ended up in multiple pieces or completely turned into Swiss cheese, in effect, or pumped full of shrap. They were effectively wiped out immediately. All the smart civilians, those that were wise and knew better, knew that they had to get out of the hot zone. They knew they needed to figure out how to operate in a low communications environment, or a no communications environment, as there were most areas where the EW systems, or electronic warfare, completely jammed redundant systems of not only portable radar sets that weren't dependent on satellite or internet to operate, but also the radio systems, which were the redundant communications. The wise civilians fled to the wilderness, and there they would establish, with good leadership, organization, coordination. They would learn how to ascertain and gather intelligence. They would learn how to create a logistical system that worked to sustain their operations. And they would learn how to become effective, and they would gain vital experience over time, starting small and working their way up in terms of collecting vital logistical supplies, weapons, and more. As any good partisan or insurgent-type guerrilla force would do, they would not be reactionary and get themselves wiped out immediately like many thousands would. As the Battle of Dallas was an enormous battle, one of several enormous battles within the South Central Invasion sector, a large PLA Group Army, which was a reserve PLA Group Army, the 59th, was operating in this sector and was bolstered by the presence of the PLA 83rd Group Army's brigade of their Air Assault Brigade. They had contributed the active duty PLA Group Army known as the 83rd PLA Group Army, which was capturing Houston at the time of the Dallas and many other battles, had effectively had their Air Assault Brigade attached to the PLA 59th Group Army for the purposes of the Dallas operation, as in the PLA 59th Group Army commanded the 83rd Air Assault Brigade, and this Air Assault Brigade gave the already enormously powerful 59th PLA Group Army additional capabilities which would enhance its operations throughout this complete mission of capturing the city, clearing the key invasion routes of I-35 East and I-35 West, because the group armies would effectively split up to ease the burden of traffic before rejoining where the highways reconnected before entering Oklahoma, as they also had logistical areas, which were CCP regime properties established by the Trojans that were set up by the 59th Support Brigade in this area. They would be stopping to effectively get fuel and food and armaments and any needed maintenance in this particular area, as this battalion of infantry, effectively from the 16th Infantry Division, Mechanized Infantry, they were holding the CCP logistical property at the time of the beginning of the invasion, but it would be effectively maintained by the forces of the 59th Support Brigade, who also had enormous logistical CCP regime properties a bit further away and could easily truck logistics back and forth after the entire highway system was clear. As the forces would also be heavily supported by the air from the PLAAF. There would be a JH-7 strike aircraft squadron. There would be a J-11 fighter squadron and a J-10 fighter squadron, as the J-10 and J-11 were the backbone of the PLAAF fighter fleet. The J-16s and JF-17s were now beginning to appear in larger numbers as well as also even the 5th gen J-20, as there were now over 300 of these 5th generation aircraft, and there were also now 400 J-16s, and there were also 170 JF-17Bs in the PLAAF, so the Chinese had a gargantuan combat air fleet, not to mention all their strike aircraft, including those in their reserve forces, as well as also their fighters that were in reserve as well, as they also had an enormous strategic bomber fleet, which consisted largely of H-6 bombers, like the H-6Ks. They also had the H-20s, as they had 40 of these H-20s, and they had 5 bomber squadrons of these. In the east of Texas, there were the 2 bomber squadrons, one H-6K and one H-20. They effectively split up to hit various targets in northeast Texas, Oklahoma, and even one of the stealth bombers, the H-20s, would continue on their first sortie deep into Kansas to hit targets before returning to their base, doing their RTB. They would return again, as these bombers were now specifically earmarked for the DFW battle, and after hitting vital strategic targets like American defense industrial plants that were actually in the city, they would return to do effectively mass strategic bombing of civilian areas, effectively. As armed reactionary civilians would be spotted, whole neighborhoods would be laid waste to, and many thousands of non-combatants would perish, and it would end up effectively being hundreds of thousands by the time the battle ended. An entire unit would also be mostly destroyed by the tactical use of strategic bomber aircraft, which would be the 2nd of the 142nd, as not only did the Texas 36th Infantry Division, which was of the National Guard, have their forces deployed to defend vital strategic assets of America in this massive metroplex of 8 million people, as the DFW metroplex was even larger than the Houston metroplex. Although Houston itself as a city was the 4th largest city, the entire combined cities within DFW made an 8 million population. This was a massive urban center. And the 62,000 strong, ordinarily 59th PLA Group Army, which was large for a PLA Group Army, as most were 50 to 55,000 strong, was augmented by the addition of the attached 83rd Air Assault Brigade of the active duty PLA from the 83rd Group Army, and, of course, 2 paramilitary National Construction Battalions, and these battalions were fully armed and capable of fighting in combat. These were like paramilitary combat engineers, but their purpose was actually to construct forward operating bases on all of the former airports, like the Love Field Airport, the International Airport of DFW, and the Meacham International, and others, as well as also the remains, which would be smoldering, of the Naval Air Station, which would be heavily hit not only by air attack from JH-7 strikes, but also from tactical ballistic missile, cruise missile, even also artillery strikes and hypersonic missile strikes coming from conventionally equipped DF-17s with their DF-ZF glide warheads, and short-range artillery-based tactical ballistic missiles fired by the 77th PLA Group Army, which was an active-duty PLA Group Army equipped with the A-300, the latest and greatest of the PLA's artillery, which was the longest-range artillery system in the world. It was a 300mm system, but could also be a 370mm system, which had a shorter range than the 187-mile range of the 300mm rockets. As the 370mm pods were simply gargantuan, they had a bit of a shorter range, but were still relatively long range but highly destructive. They also had the ability to equip the short-range tactical ballistic missiles known as the Fire Dragon missiles, or the BRE-8s, which were 750mm tactical ballistic missiles that were artillery-launched, and they could fire 2 at a time per system. As the artillery forces of the 59th PLA Group Army, as this was a reserve PLA Group Army, They were equipped with the 155mm towed PLL-01 howitzers, which were very capable howitzers as they could fire very new 155mm ammunition. They also had the enormously mass-produced PLL-66 towed howitzers, which were in the same weight class as the 155mm, although these were 152mm. These were enormously mass-produced by the Chinese and had a very capable ability to destroy large areas just as much as the 155s did, as they had 2 battalions within the 19th Artillery Brigade of the PLL-01 155mm howitzers. They also had 2 battalions of the PLL-66 towed howitzers. They had 2 battalions of the Type 83 multiple launch rocket systems, which were 122mm systems, and they had 1 battalion of the PHL-03 300mm rocket systems, as these equipped the reserve PLA forces most of the time as the rocket system of the 300mm caliber. As these had an 80-mile range, they were still very long-range systems, but nowhere near that of the A300, also sometimes called the AR-3 or the PHL-16. The still very capable 300mm PHL-03 equipped the reserve forces most of the time, although some reserve forces again did get equipped with the A300 as it proliferated through the PLA forces. The maneuver elements and their artillery battalions were effectively equipped with the PLZ-05 155mm self-propelled howitzers, which equipped the artillery battalion of the 35th Armored Brigade, as well as also the 16th Infantry Division. The 24th Light Infantry Brigade was equipped with the highly mobile 155mm PCL-181s. These were just as destructive as the track-based or the towed 155mm howitzers, and were also capable of firing some of the newest ammunition types like the R-37 shell with its extended range of 37 miles, which was very far reaching for a howitzer shell, and of course satellite-guided shells of other types, as the R-37 was also satellite-guided as well. And the armored forces were also very powerful and capable, as the 35th Armored Brigade came fully equipped with the Type 96Bs, which were a highly advanced and highly capable main battle tank. They were China's effectively second best tank, as well as also the armored battalions of the 16th ID, which they had 2, being equipped with the Type 88Cs, which were also an extremely capable main battle tank. These were effectively China's third best tank, as China had other main battle tank models that were older but still upgraded. These were still highly capable. And these would effectively, in Dallas, get into an armored battle with Abrams tanks. And they would square off, as the downtown would be heavily contested with its many highway areas and interchanges and plazas and transit areas, as this Type 88C is guarding an area freshly taken by their tank platoon, as they had knocked out some Abrams tanks. Also, loitering munitions would be heavily used in this fighting as well, and even air assault infantry assisting in the fighting in downtown. The combat would be savage, as the other armored battalion would take the highways in Burleson in the Fort Worth side of the Metroplex, like shown in this particular image here. As the light infantry forces of the 24th had within their battalions their fire support companies equipped with the WZ-550, which had the HJ-9 anti-tank guided missiles. They were also equipped with their ZBD-08 IFV and APC versions of the vehicle, such as this IFV shown with its effectively Gatling 35mm autocannon, which was enormously destructive. This was a wheel-based vehicle, a ZBD-08. The mechanized infantry forces of the regular mechanized infantry had their dual-purpose assault gun / mortars, such as their 120mm heavy assault gun / mortar system, which is the PLL-05, which could be fired as a direct assault gun or fired up to 5.5 miles away or 5.5 miles away as a mortar system. These, along with the Type 63 multiple launch short-range 130mm rocket systems, equipped the fire support companies within the mechanized infantry battalions of the regular mechanized infantry, as the light infantry, again, were equipped with the WZ-550s. The air assault forces, again, would contribute massively to this fighting, from the active duty 83rd PLA Group Army's 83rd Air Assault Brigade. And the armored forces would have their anti-tank companies within their armored battalions equipped with the enormously powerful AFT-10 anti-tank systems, each one alone capable of carrying 8 of these very powerful ATGMs, which could shower a target area with heavy destruction, as these missiles effectively had a 6.2 mile range, which was very long range for an anti-tank missile, and were very large and destructive as well, and could destroy a target area or vehicles, such as main battle tanks, of course. As all of this firepower was simply immense, the fighting in this area would be of an enormous size, scope, and scale, and the air-based forces would be supported by the YY-20s or YU-20s, or also known as the Y-20As, which were effectively the third largest refueler in the world in terms of refueling aircraft, as it carried a capacity of 180,000 pounds of jet fuel and could keep several squadrons airborne. As there were a handful of refueling aircraft from both China and Russia operating in North Texas, southern Oklahoma, they kept aircraft deep inland in the air for long amounts of time to continually offer combat air patrols and air support, as well as assisting them in getting back on their RTBs so that they could make it back. And as there would be an American fueler on station actually within the battle space and within range of the air defense forces of the PLA 59th Group Army, who were very well equipped, as they were equipped with older, albeit extremely upgraded weapons in terms of air defense capabilities. The 59th Air Defense Artillery Brigade had very capable air defense weapons, although they weren't the latest and greatest of the Chinese air defense systems that equipped the active duty PLA forces and some of the reserve forces. They still had very capable systems at their disposal. They had the medium range but very high altitude HQ-2J, which had a radius of 35 miles, but it also had an altitude of 18 miles, which effectively meant it could hit anything out of the sky in terms of aircraft. As this had actually been a system in terms of the original, as this was enormously upgraded and was massively upgraded from the original, but from the original, it was capable of knocking down U-2 spy aircraft and heavy strategic bombers like the American B-52. And thus, the upgraded version, which could fly even higher in altitude and had a longer range, could hit even higher flying aircraft at 18 miles high. There was no aircraft really that could fly at that altitude. So this air defense system was a highly capable air defense system, especially when paired with the extremely advanced radars of China, such as their anti-stealth radar pictured, the YLC-8E. As this was a highly portable anti-stealth radar, it made these air defense systems capable of seeing any aircraft and knocking it down. As the medium range, medium altitude, as this was medium range, high altitude, China had long range, high altitude systems, but the 59th had this as its most capable system in terms of the high altitude reach, although it was only medium range, but it had a very high altitude reach. The medium range, medium altitude HQ-12 was also a highly upgraded and very advanced system. Carried 2 missiles each on each TEL-based system, and when paired with very advanced radars available, would be able to see and knock down any type of aircraft, as the missiles had a speed of Mach 3.5 and could hit targets within a 30-mile radius and an altitude of 15 miles, and could hit slant, fast-moving targets like fighter aircraft, even cruise missiles, as it had its Mach 3.5 speed, as it was best against helicopters, drones, cruise missiles, and aircraft. This would end up knocking down lower-flying FA-18s during this operation in the DFW area, while the HQ-2J would actually swat down a KC-46A tanker aircraft that was flying in the battle space within range. As the closer-in air defense systems would consist of the HQ-7Bs, which were a short-range and lower-altitude system, as well as also the SP-AAA-95s, which had a quad 25mm autocannon, but also 4 of the FN-16 air defense missiles, which were an upgrade on the FN-6s, which had the ability to turn 18G turns to go after targets, which were a much more highly advanced missile than the original FN-6, as the FN-6 had once replaced the QW-2 missiles, as the FN-6 had a slightly longer range and more capabilities. The FN-16 was even more advanced, that now equipped the SP-AAA-95s. The wheel-based air defense system, the HQ-7B, was slightly longer range and higher altitude capable than was the SP-AAA-95, but the SP-AAA-95 equipped the air defense battalions within the 35th Armored Brigade, as well as also the 16th Infantry Division, while the 24th Light Infantry Division was equipped with the HQ-7Bs, as well as also there were 2 battalions of the HQ-7Bs that were within the 59th Air Defense Artillery Brigade, with also 2 battalions of the HQ-2Js, and there were 2 battalions of the HQ-12s. There were 3, again, of the short-range HQ-7Bs. These comprised the battalions within the 59th, as well as their headquarters and support battalion, which were the command and logistical forces of the Air Defense Battalion. Again, local air defense for the 16th was provided by the SP-AAA-95s, as well as also within the 35th Armored Brigade. Air defense forces of the 59th would actually spread out somewhat to better cover the entire battle space, as they had, again, quite adequate range between the different systems being all spaced out, as well as the overlay of high to medium to lower altitude, and could cover the battle space and their forces adequately from all aerial-based threats, all aviation threats, as well as could the fighter aircraft operating in this area, as these again were extremely capable fighter aircraft, the J-10 and the J-11, and they would also, along with the air defense forces of the 59th, as well as the local air defense of the combat units like the 35th, the 24th, the 16th, would all defend the airspace vigorously and prevent any of the FA-18s from being able to operate in a safe environment. Even 2 would try to avoid all the air defense missiles being fired at them, but would eventually be swatted down just in the west of the downtown area of Fort Worth. The combat in this area would be enormous, and it would be savage, and it would actually go on for 2 full days, as even after the fighting for these cities would end, and all that was contained within them, including the vital highway systems that would be seized immediately, the fighting would continue as the air assault troops would pursue all of the armed civilians after the American regime forces had all been smashed of the 36th ID that were in this area, as 36th ID forces like the 56th Infantry Brigade Combat Team were present, as well as also the 2nd of the 198th, part of the 155th Armored Brigade Combat Team that was present. which was also part of the 36th ID, and even a SHORAD battalion that was sent in to bolster the air defense capabilities of this area where the Naval Air Station in Fort Worth was, the 1st of the 204th, which would be horribly targeted by all manner of systems at the very opening of this invasion. They would be hit excessively hard. And unlike in many of the other urban battles, the air assault forces would heavily disrupt the ability to establish defenses in the hearts of the cities, as two different air assault battalions from the 83rd would seize control of the downtown of Fort Worth and Dallas in conjunction with the armored forces moving into Dallas from the 16th ID. As again, the 16th ID had two armored battalions each. One would seize Burleson and that section of highway of I-35 in conjunction with a mechanized infantry battalion of the 16th, with their other forces moving into Arlington and into Dallas, as their other armored battalion would move into the downtown area to fight alongside of the air assault forces, who would of course arrive first, as their transportation would get them there exceedingly fast, within mere minutes. As the cities would all effectively look like this as time would grind on, as the artillery and air power would simply be immense to the point to where the city would be twisted and scattered concrete and rubble cascading into the streets, buildings pancaked into themselves, holes in buildings, and more. The city would be a complete and total hellscape by the time the fighting had ended, and what was left of the non-combatant population that would be rounded up would be pressed into service as slave labor to clear the rubble and the deceased after the heavy air, missile, artillery, and ground-based forces had ravaged the entire urban area. Although the PLA was far more kind with the civilian population than was the PAP, who was not present, fortunately for the American people in Dallas at this battle, they still would be pressing the Americans into slave labor to clear rubble and also the deceased, and assist with moving other types of wreckage out of the way, as the Chinese forces would seek to turn the downtown areas of both Dallas and Fort Worth into a red zone, as these would be colonial centers for the new Chinese colonists who would come in to economically exploit and pillage the nation, as the lower 48 and lower Canada was effectively New China, as the Chinese would allow the Canadians to run their rump state as a sort of puppet state. They would directly colonize the lower 48, as they had fought to conquer it. And they would pillage its resources. They would use the civilian population as slave labor to mine, to farm all the arable farmland, and China would never have to import food from anyone ever again. They would be totally food independent, which is the main objective, and they would have a slave labor force to work the fields, as well as all the additional resources that would come with to fuel their gargantuan industrial base back home. They would send many Americans back to work in factories in China as well, or to be house laborers and other types of laborers. And in the case of American women, they would effectively get it the worst. But that is another story for another time. Again, the PLA was far more lenient with the civilian population and generally tried to follow the Geneva Conventions, although, again, mass destruction would be involved in this fighting. They were not intentionally targeting civilians per se, but they bent the rules and dropped enormous payloads on their strategic targets in areas where there were civilian neighborhoods, and they knew it. And they felt that if the civilians hadn't fled the areas, then it was their fault, effectively, for being in the combat zone. That was how they bent the Geneva Conventions, as in they didn't outright target the neighborhoods per se, but they sort of bent the rules and they targeted key strategic sites with the utmost force, such as heavy strategic bombing and heavy pulverizing artillery strikes from their various different systems, especially heavy hitting systems like these 300 millimeter PHL-03s. It was all enormously destructive. It was a symphony, an orchestra of mass destruction, as all of the artillery fire from the hundreds of artillery pieces present, in addition to all of the missile fire that would come from LA 77th Group Army short-range tactical ballistic missiles that were artillery-based, the 750mm short-range BRE-8s or Fire Dragons, as well as also all the latest and greatest missiles from the Chinese Strategic Missile Forces 612th and 613th Brigades, which were reinforced Strategic Missile Forces brigades, which their active duty forces had hypersonic missiles like the DF-17 with its DFZF glide warheads, also the DF-100 cruise missile, which is hypersonic. They also fired other newer missiles like the DF-21s of the DF-21As and DF-21Bs. The other missiles fired were older missiles from the reserve battalions called up, as well as also older widely mass-produced cruise missiles like the subsonic but extremely long-range and very accurate DH-10As, which could reach deep into America and hit targets almost anywhere within this particular sector and even beyond. As it pertained to the fighting in Dallas, it would be one of many major battles now unfolding from Laredo all the way up I-35 to Kansas, as the external forces would be racing to reach Kansas by day 2 and would actually arrive with 2 hours to spare because the plans would come together flawlessly. This would be a surgical, flawless, precise invasion. All of the strategic goals would be met and on perfect time, in some cases in the nick of time as well, but still being made. And the nation would be taken within 4 days. Really 2 days, as what comprised a nation would be effectively all removed by day 2, but there would still be mopping up to do for the next 2 days. So officially by day 4, the nation will have been completely overrun, and then tertiary areas would simply be walked into, as there would be no one there to oppose them, militarily speaking. Although a new war would begin, and this would be a war of attempted liberation on the part of the armed civilian population, which would take a while to get traction, as again they had to figure out how to operate in a communication-down environment, as well as also with their primitive means, as they didn't have anti-tank weapons that were effective. They didn't have anti-air weapons that were effective. So they would have to learn how to operate in this environment without all of these capabilities. They would have to learn how to start small and work their way up, logistically speaking. They would have to learn how to become nomadic and semi-nomadic. They would have to get good, competent leaders that knew what the hell they were doing, and they had to get good leaders that could whip those people into shape to also delegate, because delegation is a major part of becoming effective. You have to find people with the right skills and delegate positions to them so that they can make your unit effective as a unit. Otherwise, there would be nothing but failure and destruction on your end. That was what the armed civilians had to learn upon the conquest by the Chinese and their allies of the lower 48. As Russia, again, would get the resource-rich Arctic North America, including even Greenland, and would make the Arctic Sea a complete Russian ocean. The Chinese getting lower Canada and lower 48 would always be forever food independent and would colonize it. And they would even be successful in their efforts to colonize, but all the disruptions from having to fight the native population over time would almost make the effort not worth it. But the American population would dwindle down to insanely low levels by the time the war would end. And the story of that was effectively discussed in the audiobook. But as it pertains to this documentary series, this hypothetical invasion documentary series highlighting fourth-generation warfare doctrines within the scope of the 4-day invasion of America, the Battle of Dallas was an enormous battle. Many thousands of armed reactionary civilians would be annihilated by the heavy enormity of the air, artillery, missile strikes, including all the way down to ATGMs, and the raw might of the Chinese armored and infantry forces and air assault forces, and the highly advanced combat engineers that fought with all manner of robotics and drones. As all the Chinese forces had combat drones at the battalion level, the combat engineers also used many FPV drones, as did the Chinese Special Forces, which also, there was a Spec Ops battalion within the PLA 59th Group Army, which effectively was the 50th, or the 59th Special Operations Battalion. They and the combat engineers used a lot of robotics and FPV drones, as well as the amount of demolitions utilized by the combat engineers made them a devastating fighting force, as they utilized these robotics to plant demolition charges in fortified enemy-held areas, or also to clear rubble, which they were also excellent at, moving obstacles and rubble, and were able to do it under fire while laying down enormous fire, as their additional force of robotics and combat drones made these combat engineers a very elite high-tech fighting force. The same went for the Chinese Special Operations Forces as well. Overall, although it was a reserve group army, the 59th was an enormously capable, highly advanced fighting force like most of the other Chinese military forces. Even the People's Armed Police paramilitary, although they were equipped with hand-me-down weapons, their fanaticism, their fighting spirit, but also their brutality, and having hand-me-down, highly upgraded and advanced weaponry as well, made them too an extremely capable fighting force. But fortunately, again, for the civilians in DFW, they wouldn't have to deal with the People's Armed Police, but they would have to deal with the full might of the PLA and the PLAAF and the Chinese Strategic Missile Forces, firing massive volumes of tactical ballistic cruise missiles and hypersonic weapons at targets in Dallas. The Naval Air Station would be hit excessively hard by these forces. And again, the Chinese Air Defense Forces would actually get the opportunity to utilize their weaponry in their given role in this battle, as, for the most part, much of the USAF, including also naval aviation of the U.S. Navy, and Marine Corps aviation was largely destroyed on the ground, but there were some cases here and there throughout the country where the Air Defense Forces or the fighter aircraft of the coalition were able to knock down American aircraft. Some of the American aircraft were actually armed, as the most significant air battle that even occurred in the South Central Invasion sector was over nearly as soon as it began, as the long-range Chinese missiles, the PL-15s, which had a nearly 200-mile range, were fired beyond visual range and knocked down most of the American aircraft before they caught up and swatted down the last one trying to flee with a PL-12 missile, which had a 62-mile range. And effectively, that was the only real air-to-air engagement. But the FA-18s were trying to get off the ground and were being gradually swatted down by not only the air defense forces and their highly capable weapons like the HQ-12s, but also by air-to-air missiles that were fired at them as well. As the Battle of Dallas, again, was a massive battle with all manner of assets being deployed in this fighting. This was a highly significant but 2-day-long battle, with most of the heavy fighting over by the end of day 1, but residual fighting occurring into day 2, mostly small-scale skirmishes from sewer dwellers that would emerge from the sewer systems or underground of the cities and try to fight in ambush but be brutally annihilated. And the heaviest fighting on day 2 would occur in the national grasslands from all of the armed civilians that tried to flee and not be reactionary but would end up having to be reactionary, as they would be hit by 750mm or Fire Dragon tactical ballistic missiles, 300mm rockets, as well as also being attacked by air assault forces by day 2. As Dallas, again, was a massive battle, many of the fighting that would all occur simultaneously as the battle broke out at midnight, beginning with an enormous artillery barrage, missile barrage, and by the time the air power arrived, many of the units, the maneuver elements, will have been reaching their initial targets, including flank clearance operations, by around 12:30 to 12:45, as they would have to take time to maneuver into their areas from their CCP regime properties. They would also be fighting by the time the air power arrived to give them their cover. And as many of these battles would be occurring simultaneously throughout the entire metro area, they will be shown and conveyed in the best order possible. More to come in the next video as the Dallas-Fort Worth battle within the Hypothetical Invasion documentary series highlighting fourth-generation warfare doctrines now begins. This has been the intro video to the DFW battle. More to come in the next videos.